right, well, we're going to jump right in. So again, so excited to have everybody joining us today. My name is Sean Murphy, and welcome to today's webinar, Ethical Technology from Purpose to Practice. I'm a business development manager here at ThoughtWorks, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I would like to go through a few quick housekeeping items with you. So you may have noticed your audio has been muted. I assure you that is not to discourage any interaction today. It is really to optimize the sound quality of the webinar and the subsequent recording. In fact, we actually want this session to be as conversational as possible. So I encourage you to use the chat and the Q&A functionality of Zoom. We're going to have time for questions at the end, but go ahead and submit them whenever they occur to you. Also, please make sure to set your chat comments to all panelists and attendees. Early next week, you will receive the video recording from today's event, and I strongly encourage you to share that with friends and colleagues. This is a topic we're very passionate about here at ThoughtWorks, and we'd love to see it circulate further in the technology community. So now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Rebecca Parsons and Chad Wathington. Rebecca is ThoughtWorks CTO and has decades of technical experience and application development across a range of industries and systems. She's co-authored books on domain-specific languages and building evolutionary architectures. Rebecca is a strong advocate for diversity and inclusion in the tech industry and is committed to increasing the number of women in STEM fields. Chad is our Chief Strategy Officer, ensuring that ThoughtWorks can always execute on our strategy, deliver value to clients, and scale our service offerings. Chad's passionate about the future of product management and innovation. He was previously the co-founder and managing director of ThoughtWorks Products Division, where he helped drive early adoption of Ruby on Rails and sponsored our early push into continuous delivery and DevOps. So welcome, Rebecca and Chad, and thank you so much for joining me in today's discussion.
Thank you, Sean. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Sean.
So let's just dive right in. And I think, for those of you who are joining us and maybe didn't see, we just recently released a Perspectives article on this topic. So this is the accompanying webinar. And I think in that Perspectives article, we really did a good job of setting the scene. So let's do that right now. And maybe I'll just kind of kick it off with you, Rebecca. What does it mean to be a company who uses technology ethically?
Well, the first thing to realize is that technology is not neutral. We often think of technology is going to solve all the world's problems for us. But the fact is, technology can be used for good, but there are also downsides to innovation. And so one of the first things that an organization needs to think about is, what are the possible consequences? Now, unfortunately, we are very bad at thinking about what the unforeseen consequences are of our creations, because we're all excited about the problem that we're solving. And so it's important for organizations to really think about, what are the ways this technology can be used and misused? What is the impact of this technology on people who don't look like me? There's an astounding number of products that don't work well for African Americans, or don't work well for women, or don't take into account the needs of particular groups, perhaps non-English speakers, because we just don't think about it. We're in our own little bubble solving our problems, and we just don't see what those consequences are. And so it's important for organizations to really consciously think about, how is this technology going to impact the broader world, society, other businesses?
Yeah, so really kind of taking a step outside of your purview and looking at things holistically. And that's why I really love this topic is, with everything going on in the world, I think we're in a position now where people are beginning to do that. And I think when you look at technology, that's something that people never really, I think the average person doesn't really think of technology with that lens. So I'm glad to be having this conversation today. Now, I guess that was great for kind of setting the stage. Why is it important to consider the ethical impacts of the technology you're adopting or applying beyond just the given of, being a decent human or it being the right thing to do? Like, what are some of the consequences of failing to do that?
Well, there can be legal consequences. There can be reputational consequences. Some of these, in fact, can be life and death. When we start looking at where some of these AI technologies are being deployed in things like healthcare and finance and insurance, you can have a detrimental impact on a person's life. And that can result in reputational damage. And so organizations, there's business value to thinking about the ethics of the technology that we're delivering. It's not just about being a good person. That's pretty important, but there's also business value to thinking about it and understanding, again, how things can be misused. I mean, look at what's happening with Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg is trying really hard to say, hey, I just built the platform, but we're starting to see how the consequences of this are playing out.
Yeah, I mean, it would, obviously back when Facebook first came to fruition, it was something that was probably never taken into consideration, and now look where we ended up. So exactly. Very interesting. Now, Chad, what do you see as the responsibilities of organizations in keeping people safe and driving social change?
I think we often tend to think of it from preventing a negative consequence. And I think society's expectations have changed, right? So rather than think, oh, I'm going to limit the downside, in the context of what Rebecca talked about, like there's this, you look at movies and there's sci-fi dystopia, right? So we think about technology doing bad things, but technology, we're stewards of it to drive social change in the world. We're stewards of it to make sure that the things we build help people where they can in a non-tech utopian way. And so when you think about generational changes, we did a bunch of research as ThoughtWorks 2 years ago about Gen Z. And Gen Z is a lot more expecting of their employers to drive social change in their work and to keep people safe and to think about the consequences of their, what you're doing corporately in a proactive way. And so when we start to evaluate, okay, we're building something, what can it do? What harm can it cause? What things can we drive that are positive? Who does it affect? What are those constituencies? We'll talk a little bit more about that later, and it's in the article. And then to break that down and have a real holistic view of, hey, can we affirmatively move on the positive foot rather than just recognize that, we created a biased algorithm at the end of the day? Can we assess that this could do harm, but now we have an opportunity to do something that changes the conversation? And you could see with a lot of the civil discourse in the United States right now, and all over the world really, that people are asking more of companies in general. And then when you think about what companies do at the intersection of tech, it's a great opportunity for us to really think about the scope of the things that we're building.
Yeah, that's a great response. And we had a comment here in the chat. Once again, want to encourage everybody to set your chat to all panelists and attendees, but stewards of technology was something that you mentioned. And I think, as the people who are building the technology, that's something to always keep in mind because the ramifications are well beyond just us. So, Rebecca, previously you mentioned, like, what are the ramifications? Well, there could be legal ramifications. And as we kind of dive a little bit deeper into that and look at technology ethics gone wrong, what are most organizations failing to consider when it comes to technology and ethics? ethics. And I think maybe kind of a follow-up to that is, what are some of the more typical blind spots or danger areas that might be unchecked?
Well, I think there are a few of them. The first is we have a particular problem and context in mind when we're creating a technological solution to a problem. And very often that's the context that we think about, not other contexts. So that's really the first blinder is we are so focused on whatever problem that we're trying to solve that we don't see, well, wait a minute, there's a big broad world out there and different contexts in which this can play out. Related to that also is thinking about how the technology can be gained. What we're looking at is, let's think about some of the news algorithms. How can those be manipulated to a different purpose? There's a field really of meme generation. How do you manipulate these different algorithms in such a way that a meme will then get to the mainstream media? And there are groups that actually are actively trying to promote certain ideas with the objective of getting it into the mainstream consciousness. And they do that through manipulating the algorithm. But we don't always think about, what are the vulnerabilities that are built into those algorithms. And finally, I think it's not considering the broader set of stakeholders. When we are looking at, again, we're focused on a problem and we're targeting this solution to a particular category of individuals. Well, what about other individuals? How is it going to play out in those contexts? Is that going to be a positive or a negative? And so those are the kinds of failures that initially come to mind. And the other thing to realize is, if somebody is going to try to misuse your technology, they can focus just on that technology. But it's asymmetric, because if there's 1,000 hackers out there, you have to figure out how to counteract all of their different strategies. Whereas an individual who is trying to misuse your technology, for example, can just focus on you, and they can throw whatever tools they have. They're just focusing on one. You have to protect from all of them. So it's asymmetric in that. So understanding the different vulnerabilities and how these can result in unethical consequences is important.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, at least speaking for myself, when I meet somebody, I'm the type of person that always gives everybody the benefit of the doubt. I like to see the good in people. And when we're building technology, you can't exactly do that. You have to account for the people that, as you mentioned, are going to try and game the system and the bad apples that are out there. That's a really good piece of insight there. So what are some examples of where technology has failed from an ethics perspective? I mean, you briefly kind of hinted at Facebook previously, but maybe diving a little bit deeper, like, where did technology fail from an ethics perspective? What impact did that have? And then maybe what were some of the learnings there? And I'll kick this one over to you, Chad. I would love to hear your opinion on this.
So I think there's three classes that I'll talk about. The first is algorithmic bias. We see that in the news often, right? And in the article that we were referencing, we talk about Apple Card, and there was a bit of a hubbub around the approvals across gender. And what turned out was that Apple and Goldman Sachs were using the spouse's approval in the context of the other spouse, which is affecting women more predominantly. We also saw the example of United Health with their algorithm that was trying to assess health risks. And they use a proxy of health costs to understand health outcomes. And because ethnic minorities have less access to healthcare, they were spending less. So it looked as if they were healthier in the risk assessment, which made no sense.
So just to clarify that, they eliminated the racial bias, but then the racial bias kind of made its way back into the algorithm.
The racial bias was in the algorithm because they didn't anticipate that there was a second order effect of less access to healthcare meant you had less overall health costs, which then made it look like, you know, you were less risky for the same set of conditions. And so those kind of algorithmic biases are often unintended and are not getting the data right or not getting the understanding of the systemic issues. Sometimes they're intended, but you can largely say the algorithmic bias is something that, again, has been in the news a lot as an unintended consequence. And then the second area that I talk about is the use of data, people's personal information, privacy. There's obviously fingerprinting, tracking. And if you don't know about fingerprinting, you can go, I think it's Panopticlick by the EFF. It's a great resource to check your own browser fingerprint and how you can be tracked across the web. And so there's a whole bunch of uses of data that don't make a lot of sense. One thing that didn't get too much press coverage involving Facebook was the Federal Housing Administration in North America asked them to stop allowing what ultimately ended up being 5,000 categories in their ad targeting, which people were using to target protected groups or untarget protected groups. So they, you know, because of the way the targeting system was built, it allowed protective class information to be embedded in it. And so Facebook removed 5,000 categories from the way they think about ad targeting. And again, these uses of data and how we think about what's appropriate is really important. And I think that's an example of government intervention where the Federal Housing Authority said, hey, you might be promoting housing discrimination. You know, you need to stop that. The third category, and I think some of it has been in the chat and questions so far, is intentional unethical use of tech. This is, it's really interesting. I like casual games and non-casual games. And you see the headlines often about, you know, a child who spent $5,000 on an app or a person who's addicted and is building, you know, playing casual games and spending up a lot of money. But what is not often talked about is that those apps are using cognitive psychology tricks, well-known cognitive psychology tricks, to get the small child to spend or the person who has the gambling addiction to spend. If you want to, again, know about these tricks that a lot of applications use, there's a book called Hooked, which is about this cognitive psychology loop to hook people on doing something. And the simple bits of it are you do a trigger, an action, a variable reward, and investment, and you can learn about the cycle. And once you learn about the cycle, you'll see that so many applications do it. The mobile alerts on your phone use this cycle very often. And a lot of that's intentional. People want you to use their applications. And so there's you know, I think the intentional use of technology that has questionable ethics is something we need to talk about more. And I don't think, to your question, that a lot of companies have come under fierce scrutiny for the consequences of this.
Yeah, there's I have a couple comments on that. I think we'll get into this maybe in a little bit about, you know, and we mentioned this in the article as well, like where's that line, where's the divide between ethics and profits? And that's kind of a little bit at what you're hinting at there. I did smile a little bit when you mentioned the young child with the massive purchases in the app store, because I'll never forget the time when my sister-in-law called me telling me about how my nephew had just spent $180 on Animal Farm. So yeah, I fully understand where you're coming from here. So for everybody, just to kind of summarize that, where has technology ethics failed? I think Chad mentioned 3 key things there: algorithmic bias, use of data. Everybody go check out, I believe you said Panopticlick. Is that correct, Chad?
Panopticlick by the EFF.
Interesting. And then obviously the intentional unethical use of technology. So really, really good stuff there. Now, what about if you're looking at your organization? So let's kind of explore the practical things that organizations can do to take an ethical approach here. And maybe I'll point this one toward you, Rebecca. What are the main principles an organization should keep in mind when it comes to ethical technology? And then what are the most fundamental building blocks of an approach?
Well, the first thing is to, the first principle is to really decide what your objective is and how you position that objective. So when we think about ethical technology, you have to have a set of guidelines, and what does that actually mean? What does doing the right thing mean in this context? And that's not always clear. One interesting study that I read about, people were asked 2 different questions about what should a car do, a self-driving car. Should it prioritize the life of the driver or the life of the pedestrian? And the first question people were asked is, what kind of car do you think the auto manufacturers should build? Should they build cars that prioritize the driver or the pedestrian? And when asked what the manufacturers should do, the answer was they should build cars that prioritize the life of the pedestrian. But when they were asked the question, what kind of car would you buy? The answer was they wanted to buy a car that prioritized the life of the driver. Okay, so what are the auto companies? What does good look like in this context? And who should be making that decision? So that's an important starting point. Is what do you believe the objective is, and what is the standard for ethics? Some things are obvious. Blatant discrimination, blatant bias, that's obviously wrong. But when you look at it from a corporation perspective, again, what is the responsibility? There may be algorithms, for example, that discriminate against a protected group in some way, but result in higher profit. Okay, well, if you can find a proxy, you can make more money for the corporation, and so you are in a position where you are really trading off profit versus fairness. And organizations, again, have to decide, what does good look like in this context. The next principle, and this is related to the blind spots I was talking about earlier. You have to assume that a broad range of people are going to be interacting with your technology, and so you want to, as much as possible, try to get that diversity of perspective on, is this technology good or bad? Does this technology work well or not? Because what looks great to me might actually be very problematic for someone else. And I can't know what that person's perspective is unless I actively go out and seek it. So having those diverse perspectives on what should the technology be doing? What should good look like is another critical principle. And that has to be actively sought. You know, you can't just count on people giving that information to you. You know, this is something that you really do have to be quite active. And the third is really to think about what are the systemic factors. This is particularly true when we think about bias in algorithms. What are the structural issues that might exist that could impact the way that the technology is used or the way the consequences play out? We again often just think about whatever the context is that we're imagining, and don't always see those structural or systemic factors and how they impacted. You know, there's been some talk in the chat about bias, and in particular how that word actually does feel, you know, very strong. And you know, when people hear bias, you know, they start to get defensive and sit up straight. And you know, are you telling me I'm a bad person? Bias does not have to have anything to do with a good or bad position. One example I like to cite: there was a teaching hospital that was trying to develop an algorithm to determine whether or not a patient should go into ICU after a particular procedure. And they trained it up using two different models. One, which actually gave better results, was very difficult to interpret. It was very hard to see what factors the algorithm was taking into account in making its recommendation. The other approach made it very obvious what the decision making was. And what they learned is their data set was biased because their protocol in the past had always been, if a patient was asthmatic, you put them immediately into the ICU. And so none of those records appeared in the data set. It's not that the researchers were biased against people with asthma, but there was a structural problem in the data that they were using that they hadn't recognized. And so we need to be very diligent in thinking about what are those structural factors. What is the system that created this set of data that I might be using to learn from, or what is the system that creates the context in which this technology is going to be deployed?
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's a great answer. And I think, you know, something that, as we talk about that approach, kind of leading into the next question that I have for you, Chad, is kind of relates to like having the right people in the room. So, you know, I think like design obviously playing a big role. Like, when you are, you know, building out or looking at technology and ethical technology, what is the role and the impact of design while doing that?
So I think the first thing is pretty basic, is that, you know, there's a famous Steve Jobs quote about design is how it works. So if we are building things and how they work is the fundamental purview of design, then the act of design and design thinking and people who wear the hat of, you know, doing design across a team, that's really an important area in solving some of these problems. And I think, you know, when I say solve some of these problems, there's also a long running thing in the chat about the scale and scope, right? So you've got society, you've got politics associated with society, and then you've got technology. And what we're talking about is how do you mitigate right now, as you're building technology, some of the larger issues that flow through. And you can't do that. The scope of that is tremendous if you step back, right? Because you can think about all kinds of constituencies, accessibility, race and ethnicity, gender. There's so many places where you have to try to pull things together. And the question isn't, can I block and tackle every little piece? it's very hard to do that in the scope of, oh, I've got to build a mobile app to, make it easier for my customers to access my bank. So design is really good because we don't have to think about problems. And when you look into design thinking, we don't have to think about problems as all of their constituent small pieces broken down and then analyzed and then aggregated. We can think about problems from a pattern matching perspective, from a synthesis perspective, from a abductive reasoning perspective. And all these things are sort of ways of thinking in design as a discipline that help us sort of say, okay, at a high level, what problems are we trying to solve? What solutions, what things have we done in the past that might look like this, that help us understand an additional problem we might be creating? Who do we need to pull in the room? Can we go watch people in, Rebecca mentioned before, like understanding who's really using your application? Can we figure that out? Can we watch people in context? Can we see the effects in real time of some of the things that we're building? Help us decrease the scope of the surface area of all the things we might consider. The other thing is that some of the problems we're dealing with are non-deterministic in nature. So if we're trying to figure out all the pieces, we really have to observe the end behavior to understand some of the effects. And so again, using more design-centered approaches to help us sort through some of the problem space is really, really important. Also, outside of design, we see some of these same kind of thought patterns in security with threat modeling, because again, you can't anticipate every possible way that an actor might attack a system, but there are good ways to reason about it. And I think it's a similar way of thinking and approaching ethics in tech.
So, Chad, I love that, and that it brought something up to me, like outside of design. What about, like, how do you communicate ethical approaches to people within the organization that are non-tech facing? Like, how should that happen? What does that look like?
Again, I think because who you want in the room is, you want as many perspectives as you can bring. And that goes across, roles in your company, to ways of thinking about customer interactions, to socioeconomic class, religion, etc. You want people to spot things. In the workplace safety movements, like you walk around a factory and OSHA's been there and it says, if you see something, say something. That's what we want as the ethos in terms of ethics. And it's hard if you leave it to the technologist. It's hard if you do a top-down thing where the leaders of the firm say, we're going to be ethical. Well, what does that mean? What it means is actually where we can understand the effects of what we're doing and, again, make them positive or mitigate downsides of things we hadn't considered. We want to crowdsource that as much as possible. So it goes for more than just being about communication and talking about ethical tech or having teams have some processes. You really want to rally the entire organization to be thinking about this constantly, for it to be part of your general ethos. And that means communicating from the top that it's important. That means making sure that small groups of people feel empowered to say, hey, has anybody thought about this? Let's go talk about it. And the article talks about feedback loops, making sure they're really effective feedback loops, so that people can say, we got 5 customer service inquiries that look like this. I think this is a problem. And then that works its way into the technology organization. So it's a real holistic thing if you want to really bring those perspectives into the room, both from when you're starting and you're building to when you're in production and running. You want everyone to feel like, oh, this is something that we all care about and we should all be thinking about, and we should be bringing those perspectives.
Yep. I love that. And I think that, the article referenced something about kind of the younger working population and their focus on social impact and how that helps companies with a strong focus will be able to attract and retain top talent better. Now, as you look at the organization as a whole, you obviously have your shareholders and your board to answer to. And I hinted at this earlier, and the article even, I think, briefly hints at this. There's not a right answer. Is there a right answer? Where is the line between ethical technology and profitability? Is there an answer to that? I'll open that up to both of you. Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, I think it has to be something that is discussed within the context of the organization. And we also need to involve the broader society. I don't think as a technologist, I should be the one who decides whether or not the life of the pedestrian is prioritized over the life of the driver or vice versa. That is not a decision that a technologist should make. That's not really a decision that an auto manufacturer should make. That's a decision as a society that we have to start to talk about what are the things that we want. What does it mean to be a responsible corporate citizen? And that's something that the broader society and needs to decide. Our responsibility as technologists is to make sure that they have the information to make an informed choice. It's becoming less common, but 5 years ago, lots of people would have said, "Oh, well, there's no bias in Facebook. It's an algorithm." Well, an algorithm is written by a person, and it has a particular objective in mind, and it is biased to try to optimize for that objective, whatever that objective is. And as a society, we need to understand what those objectives are and whether we buy into them or not. As someone said in the chat, we ought to have the ability to say no. And as a society, we should be deciding those things. As technologists, we have to make sure that there is enough understanding of what the issues are so that society can make that informed choice. And that's a long and complicated process.
Yeah, I think that's good. And it actually kind of, you might have even answered the next question that I had, which was, like, given the reach and speed of technology, and you look at the mission to really kind of facilitate and drive global change, where do you see the most potential for big enterprises to harness technology to drive positive social impact? And I think part of that is as you mentioned, just looking at society and not the organization, but as it relates to the organization as a whole, like, what are some things that they can be doing differently to kind of drive that change?
I think we mentioned it before, but I think society, our expectations are changing. I think there were many myths. The myth of Milton Friedman, the Chicago School of Economics, saying that businesses should only care about shareholder value. Well, obviously, in a capitalist system, everyone should care about shareholder value in a corporate context. But man, there are a lot of stakeholders. They're employees, they're your customers, they're the people on the street you've never seen, that are all stakeholders to what corporations do. And I think there is a shift going on, and everyone understanding, like, okay, it isn't that corporations exist over here and society exists over here. As we particularly build things like driverless cars, right, there is a different conversation that has started to happen. And I think where the opportunities exist is understanding, again, the harm is possible and benefit is possible, and that this conversation must happen at lots of different levels. It has to happen in governments, it has to happen on the street, it has to happen, corporation to corporation, it has to happen with inside companies, from employees to leadership. So there's a bunch of different balancing things that have to happen to find those areas, because I think they exist in every industry and in every area, right? We talk a lot about climate and climate change, and there are areas where we can deploy technology to drive fundamental change, but we have to have those conversations, and there has to be agreement, and there was something in the chat about politics. There is politics in those conversations, and the will to do things, and the will for, you know, a corporation to be able to show up with the government and make something happen. So I think there's a lot of scope for good things. It's just the conversations have to improve, the feedback loops have to go, and, you know, we have to get to a place where some of these conversations are really at the forefront of public consciousness. And I think some of our job as technologists is to make these things clear.
It's a great point. Like, having those difficult conversations is one of the most important things to do in order to move us all forward here. So I know we're kind of running out of time, so I would like to get to some audience Q&A, and we have quite a few questions here. A lot kind of based around, is there a roadmap to practice ethical technology? I think that's a common theme when looking at these questions. Like, what should some of these people attending the webinar today, what should our attendees follow? Like, what is some advice? Is there a resource or anywhere we can point them in the direction of, hey, we need a roadmap for this ethical approach? What does that look like?
Well, there are tools that are available, and I believe that will be going out with the recording of the webinar. There's something called the ethical operating system that allows you to think about what are some of the consequences. There are tarot cards that you know, it kind of gamifies where, okay, well, what does it mean from this perspective? And so we're developing tools that allow for that probing. But I think to start, you have to understand what it is that you are trying to achieve, and, you know, organizations have to decide, you know, what am I going to try to do in this context? Where do I feel like I'm exposed? As Chad brought up, some of the techniques that we use in security for threat modeling are the same kinds of techniques you would use. You know, where is the most potential for harm in what I'm doing? What are the vectors through which this technology might have negative consequences or be able to be misused? And a critical part of this, and as somebody mentioned in the chat, you know, developers don't necessarily make decisions like that in a vacuum. I am still astounded that some developer somewhere thought it was the right thing to do whatever they did to the emission systems and the VWs, so that they worked one way when the emissions test was being done, and worked another way when it was actually on the road. Some developer did that, but the entire culture was there that made that developer feel like that was the right thing to do. And so it does start from setting the culture that, you know, we do want to behave ethically, and, you know, and you can't create ethical tech in a culture that doesn't value ethics.
Yeah. What about an interesting question that came across? Are there reporting mechanisms for unethical technology? So if I see an unethical practice, is there somewhere I should go or somewhere I should report that?
I think there's probably a couple different ways to handle it. I think first, as I said before, it depends on if you have the feedback loops in the entire company to have those conversations. But I think teams can set up, in terms of continuous improvement cycles, they can set up a way for people to approach them. And so one of the things is, I think sometimes we have a tendency to try to start big. If we start small and say this particular set of technology teams are going to now think about building the capability and practice in this area, those teams could put their hands up and start to advertise, hey, if you're seeing things that aren't right in the terms of the use of this application or the implication of this application, come talk to us. I think setting up those kinds of feedback loops in the small are the first step. And then once you have the culture, to what Rebecca talked about, then you can set them up in the larger.
I think, yeah, that's a good point. What about, so kind of in that same vein of like, how do I look at this? And if I do see an unethical technology practice, how do I report it? Similar to that, what if I'm looking to do business and, you know, like what are some signs? What are some potential red flags? What should I look out for when vetting a new partnership? How does that, like, what are any advice on that, I guess?
That's an excellent
You just
question.
simply look at, do you simply look at like the corporate social responsibility policy and like what does that look like?
Well, and that is where you start to get into trouble. I mean, one of the interesting things with all of the statements that have been coming out from primarily U.S.-based companies about, you know, in support of Black Lives Matter or in support of the Me Too movement, and, you know, and employees and former employees are coming out and saying, excuse me, but, you know, that isn't how things are here. So it is very difficult, particularly from the outside, to assess, you know, what really is the culture of a potential business partner. And I think it's one of those things where you just kind of have to probe, you know, maybe do a little pilot work with the partner. Look at how they manage in the contracting process. I remember in one situation I was in, the first draft of a contract that I received from a potential partner, it was all one-sided. They got everything, we got nothing. They could exploit everything, we could exploit nothing. It was incredibly one-sided, and that put up all kinds of red flags for me. That, okay, you know, we really need to keep an eye on this partnership because they're in it for them. They're not in it to consider a true partnership. But I do think some of these things just have to be trial and error. You know, people can say all kinds of things on their website, and that doesn't necessarily reflect what the culture of the organization is, what the leadership of the organization is.
I know there's
also
an ethical sourcing and an ethical, you know, social sourcing kind of movement. I don't know personally a lot about it, but I know our head of procurement knows some folks that are in that area. So I think there are some organizations trying to address that.
That's good to know. I mean, it's good that this is something that's, you know, as you guys mentioned in the article, it was always kind of like a soft, this is part of our organization, but now it's been thrust to the forefront with everything going on in the world, and it's so great to see. I think we have time for maybe just a couple more questions from the audience. This one I think is pretty interesting. So this relates to data gathering. So as far as ethics of data gathering is concerned, with email opt-out being the norm in the US after users attend events or engage with brands, the attendee is wondering the degree to which an opt-in model would stunt startup growth or lower the ability to compete and share value with a wider base. Do you have any thoughts on that? It kind of feels a little bit like that relates to GDPR, but any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think you have to balance these concerns in general Again, ThoughtWorks had its own product division, and we often did downloads without an email. We still do. I think in each individual case, you have to think about what data you want to keep, what data is right to ask for in the context, and give people the right choices to do what makes sense. I don't think that there's any easy answer of opt in or opt out, but I think the question really goes to, are you willing to trade the number of, signups that you get in a startup context for what you feel is the right policy for your audience and, what people are willing to do. And I think that you could make that trade-off. I've certainly been part of those conversations. I think I think more people will opt in than you think, and probably less people opt out than they should. So it's hard to balance.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about the organization. We've talked about kind of the climate globally, and this question I like because it focuses on us as individuals. So what should we do, or what can we do as individuals to help reduce the digital divide?
Well, as technologists, I think one of the things that we can do is take into account the fact that not everybody has, fast access to the internet. They don't necessarily have, the newest phone. Very often, we forget about that part. That, oh wait, there are people, who are going to try to do this on feature phones. And there have been some stories, for example, kids trying to do online learning, having to hang out in parking lots to get access to Wi-Fi because they don't have they don't have internet access in their home, or there are so many people trying to use the access in the home that it's being overwhelmed. If you have multiple kids in school at the same time and people trying to do Zoom conferences, they just don't have enough bandwidth. And so thinking about what are the ways to deliver value if you don't have the fancy phone, or if you don't have fast connectivity. As individuals, I think that's something that we need to think about, to make sure that services that are available are actually available as broadly as possible.
So we are coming up on time here. And before we sign off, I do obviously want to give you, Rebecca, and yourself, Chad, I'd love to give you, the stage for any final thoughts on this topic before we have to go.
Well, I guess I've been a technologist for a very long time, and so clearly I feel there is an important role for technology to play in solving the problems of the world. But I also have come to realize that we need to do a better job of understanding what the scope of possible solutions are, and when a particular solution might be better. And some things we can actually solve without technology in a better way. And so I think when we look at it from the perspective of ethical tech, understanding that there is a broad scope of possible solutions, and bringing that ethical lens to the problem of how do we actually choose which of these alternatives we want to look at.
I would
Chad,
say
any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I would say engage. I see there's tons of passion in the chat and the Q&A about this topic. I think that, again, we have a tendency to, see the systemic thing, and then we want to solve the systemic thing, especially as technologists, many of us, the engineering mindset. But I think often the best way to get started, because this is about people, is to get the people who are like-minded in your sphere and say, hey, let's start doing it. And then that allows it to grow. And then people outside of your corporate context and your company context, maybe there's two groups of people who get together again and say, "Ooh, we learned something about algorithmic bias. Great, let's turn that into something more and more." And so I think engage and get started with people, because we can sit and think about the systems and how it all hangs together. There are people who don't have access to tech today. There are people who are experiencing some sort of inequality because of something we built today. There are consequences today, and so let's get at it. You turn the passion into people working together, and like I said, putting your hand up in your company context and saying, "Hey, we built this. If you see any problems, come talk to us." Start those conversations, and turn that energy into making it happen.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, what I've really taken away from our time together today is, we're all in this together. And it goes a long way if you just kind of take a step back and put yourself in other people's shoes every once in a while. So, well, I do want to wrap it up and take the time to thank everybody for joining us today. Again, this is something we're very passionate about here at ThoughtWorks. So when this recording comes out, we'd love for you to share it with your network. Appreciate all of the great comments in the chat and the Q&A, and thank you so much for taking the time. ThoughtWorks, over the years, just so this is, as I mentioned, been a focus of ours. We also do a lot of work in the green cloud space, the responsible organization space, and then bringing enterprise firms up to speed with our modern digital business program. If you have any further questions, either related to this webinar today or related to ThoughtWorks as a whole, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is sean.murphy@thoughtworks.com. And we would all encourage you to feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn as well. So we'll be sending out a post-event survey asking you about your experience with us today. We'd love for you to fill that out. And finally, I want to extend a sincere thanks to you, Rebecca, and you, Chad. Thank you so much for joining us today and leading this discussion. I had a lot of fun, and thank you, everybody, once again for joining us. Take care.